check, 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 check.
John, you want to check this?
Test 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? I think I can hear myself, which is unusual. By the way, Don, I'm Alex. I was gonna say if I'm on the keyboard.
Yeah, you'll mute it when he's on the keyboard. Is that right here? Okay, that's right. You just mute it right here along. Yeah, perfect. So when you get ready, just push it. So start out here at the podium, and then,
Test it, or
no. When you're ready to start, you start at the podium, and you'll be back and talk.
Okay.
And then when you're done, go over to the. Okay, right. Okay, I'll mute you, so don't worry. So try it. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, if you're not used to it, go ahead and try it again. Make sure we're hot.
test, 1, 2, 3.
Good. Okay.
I can't. Can I hear myself?
No, I'll be able to hear when I am.
Okay. Oh, to mute it. Okay. Until we get to the hymn,
Go back up after the song.
and the keyboard's up there.
Keyboard's already up there.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, and everybody joining us online. This is the second session in what we call the absolute basics of the Wesleyan Way, but I don't know if that's really a fair way to call this class because we're going to get into a lot of details here. Tonight's session is on the life of John Wesley, so it's sort of biographical, sort of informative. You can advance the slide there, Pastor Jim, please. So it really covers kind of the first half of his life, his background, and it says 1703 to 38, but we're going to go sort of back to what Pastor Jim talked about a little bit last week, some of what was going on in England and John Wesley's family. Before that, we have a hymn to introduce this session. For tonight, I chose Jesu, lover of my soul. So that term Jesu is the Latin version of Jesus. And if you watch a video of some English people singing this, you'll hear them say Jesu. That's sort of the English way to say that. But I think most proper Latin would be Jesu or Jesu. I say Jesu. This was written by Charles in 1740. And this is after some of what we'll talk about in the session tonight, that they had both been missionaries and gone overseas, and they've experienced both literal storms at sea and a lot of self-doubt and figuring out what they were going to do with their careers in the church. This has a lot of features of Charles' hymns. It's very personal. He puts you in his place using me and I, these pronouns. So you will take on his doubts when you sing this hymn. And there's lots of water imagery in this. So at first it's very dark. There's lots of doubt, thoughts of what might happen at the storm at sea, death and destruction. But in the end, it's going to be triumphant, and the water that's going to be a symbol of eternal life. For the tune, I've chosen this classic Victorian tune, Aberystwyth. And you can tell by that word that it comes from Wales to have all those continents crunched together like that. So it's a pretty challenging hymn in terms of it's in a minor key. It's very dark. It fits the hymn very well. If you don't mind, Pastor Jim, going to the next slide, I would like to keep this Bible verse, this section of verses in mind for the fourth verse. This is from John chapter 4. Jesus replied, "Anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again." This is, by the way, the Samaritan woman at the well. "But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life." "Please, sir," the woman said, "give me this water. Then I'll never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come here to get water." So this is the final verse which turns the water that's very destructive at first into something that's life-sustaining. So we'll do this hymn now with the help of our singers, please. I'll introduce the tune, and then you all can join me. We're going to sing verse 1, 2, and 4, which will be on the screen for you.
I invite you to stand with us as we sing this hymn. save your life till the storm of life is past. Safe into the heaven guide. Oh, receive my soul at last. Other refuge have I none. Hangs my helpless souls on thine. Live on, leave me not alone. Still so poor and comfort me. All my trust on thee is safe. All my help on thee I bring. Cover my defenseless head with the shadow of thy wing. Then trust grace with thee is found, grace to cover all my sin. Let the healing streams abound, make and keep me pure within. Thou of life, the fountain art, freely let me take of thee. Spring thou up within my heart, rise to all eternity.
Pardon, sorry about that. I was stuck on 4 verses. The verse we didn't sing, not only does Charles perfectly encapsulate the story of the Samaritan woman at the well in that 4th verse, but in the 3rd verse he talks about, lo, I sink, I faint, I fall, and he's clearly talking about the storm at the sea that the disciples experience, where they see Jesus walking on the water and Peter goes out to meet him, and then he loses his assurance and starts to sink. So we will see in the story of John Wesley's life. I'm going to go, I can control this now, I think. Okay, good. We're going to go back in time to the start of the English Reformation. Pastor Jim talked last week about King Henry VIII and his trouble that led him to ultimately forming the Church of England. I think a lot of people don't know that before all that went down with his wives, he was a great defender of the Roman Catholic Church, and he would dispute with Martin Luther, and he was given this title, Defender of the Faith, that I think the King of England still holds, but in the Church of England. And so after his marriage troubles, he formed the Church of England, but it really was the Catholic Church in England. You know, there's lots of Eastern Orthodox Church that's going to be Russian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox, sort of broken down by nation, whereas the Roman Catholic was all centered in Rome. What Henry wanted was a Catholic Church that he could be in charge of. So he was the head of the church, and he also went as far as dissolving the monasteries, and that way he could get their money and formed various parishes. From the very start of this English Reformation, there were these folks called dissenters. And dissenters were, as I think Pastor Jim mentioned, people that wanted nothing to do with this new Church of England, even though it was not Roman Catholic. So these would be Puritans, Congregationalists, Anabaptists we talked about last week. Brownists were the people that ended up founding Plymouth, and that was in 1620. This term enthusiast meant anybody advocating any political or religious cause in public, and there's lots of those people today. And Quakers, that's another group. So following Henry's death, he did end up having a son, believe it or not, and this son became King Edward VI, but he was just a boy. And so his handlers, the people that were in charge, took the opportunity to further the Reformation in a more radical way than King Henry was comfortable with. King Edward VI doesn't live very long, he's not very healthy, and so he is succeeded by Mary I, and we know her as Bloody Mary because she not only restored Catholic rule in England, but she put to death a lot of the reformers. So after that turmoil, Elizabeth I comes back. That's a different Henry's daughter through Anne Boleyn, and she is Protestant. So she's going to reestablish now the Protestant church. One thing that came during her reign was 39 articles of faith. I think, I'm not going to get too much into theology tonight, but I think as a church we would affirm most of those very Protestant articles, but Puritans getting involved in this process were very Calvinist, so there's going to be a lot of Calvinist ideas in those. After Elizabeth, there's James I, and his big contribution was the King James Version. After James I came Charles I. So this is a Protestant person, but he married a Catholic, so he's already very suspicious now in the eyes of many Protestant English people. And the big problem he had was he fought with Parliament. And Parliament at this point was wanting to exercise more control than the king. So this led to the English Civil War, and that had a few different outbursts. But you'll recall this is when Charles I gets beheaded, the king, and Parliament takes over, and Oliver Cromwell becomes the Lord Protector, and he's Puritan. So there's so many back and forth situations going on with the church in England. And all the meantime, religious liberties were coming and going. So depending on who was in charge, whether it's Oliver Cromwell or a king that wanted to exercise more influence on the church, or whether it was a Roman Catholic, because eventually a new Catholic king did come back. That was the restoration of Charles II and his younger brother James II. To put an end to all this, there was this glorious revolution of 1688, and that is when James's daughter, Mary, who had married a Dutch lord, William, they invaded England. This is the last successful invasion of the English Isles, and they became William and Mary, and that's the glorious revolution of 1688. They were going to allow Parliament to have their control, and so things finally became peaceful in a lot of ways in England. As the Church of England was set up, they had different rules for their worship, and that's where this term nonconformist will come in. So this is more specific. This is when somebody is saying, I am pro-king, I'm pro-Church of England, but I don't like the common book of prayer. I'm not going to seek ordination in the church. I prefer religious liberty. These are people that are not towing the line exactly in the Church of England, and we'll see how they get into trouble with some of John Wesley's family. In 1662, there's the Act of Uniformity, and this resulted in what was known as the Great Ejection. So this sent thousands of priests out of the Church of England that weren't following exactly the rules that the established church wanted. And by the way, this Book of Common Prayer, which is used for liturgy, morning prayers, evening prayers, if you know anything about the Anglican Church, they sing certain psalms, they have litanies, these responses like, Lord have mercy, after things are said, and approved, the very approved music you could use in church, for example. The Book of Common Prayer, is very important for later literature in English along the lines of the King James Version. There's many phrases found in the King James Version that are sort of common in everyday speech, as well as Shakespeare. And the third thing in that group is the Book of Common Prayer. So, for example, speak now or forever hold your peace is in the marriage section of the Book of Common Prayer. Or in the funeral section of the Book of Common Prayer, you find this phrase, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So it's very important, and it will be important when we talk about Charles Wesley, because the Wesley brothers were steeped in the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer, and they would use that in some of their hymns. Other things going on in England, there was a great plague in London in 1665. This is the bubonic plague, and that killed a quarter of the population in a year and a half. So that was a big deal. And the very next year, the Great Fire of 1666 consumed 15% of the housing and made many, many people poor, and there was a lot of destruction and turmoil going on in England, I think is my the gist of this background. So now we'll talk about the ancestry of John Wesley. And I used a couple of his grandfathers as examples of this religious liberty situation. So John Wesley, and that's not a typo. This is just when a lot of people were probably coming up with their last names. I think he was John of Wesley, and that turned into Wesley. And then John Wesley's son, Samuel, dropped the T, and that's how we get Wesley today. I describe him as John Wesley's true predecessor because he was known as being very deeply religious even as a boy. He kept a detailed diary of both his inward and outward journey through life, and we'll see John Wesley takes that up as well. He was a promising student, but instead of seeking ordination, this was his decision, he joined what was called the Gathered Church. This is sort of a dissenting group, or it's not nonconforming, it's completely dissenting. And therefore, he was going to be a target for a lot of these religious liberty laws that either, depending on the rulers in charge, were going to persecute people. He preached among common fishermen. He won souls that way in recognition as a great preacher. He did receive a license from Cromwell. So Cromwell was the Puritan ruler, and that allowed him to be a pastor. But not long after that, he was sent to prison because he wasn't using the Book of Common Prayer. And this act of uniformity that I mentioned completely ended his ministry, and he was only 26, so his life vocation was essentially destroyed at that young age. And he spent the rest of his life in poverty. Anybody wanting to be a preacher at that time and not towing the line was going to be in and out of prison or in hiding, and he died a very early death at age 42. John Wesley's other grandfather, this is Samuel Annesley. I have him that he was known as the St. Paul of Nonconformists, so he was a pretty well-known churchman himself. He was also ejected from his role as vicar by that same act of uniformity in 1662. I have a list of what these terms are that I had to look up. Rector is a priest that's in charge of a parish, sort of the chief priest. A vicar is a priest that's in a mission role, so a priest that's sent to a place that's not an established parish yet. And a curate is a priest, but it's an assistant to the rector. And we'll see John Wesley was a curate. So a priest is anyone ordained in the church to give sacraments. And of course, there's bishops in the Church of England. It's an Episcopal church. That means it has bishops and a hierarchy structure. And there's even this term primate, which is like the head archbishop or something. Now, I think I'm one of the primates here at Sunrise, but that's a different story. Samuel was stripped of property at least twice for keeping a meeting house, so this is like a church at home. And his license to be a Presbyterian teacher was granted and then revoked. But he did have considerable influence. One of his congregants was Daniel Defoe, and Daniel Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe, which I didn't read that long ago, but I was struck by how religious that story is. I just knew it as a shipwreck, a guy getting by on an abandoned island, but it's very Puritan in its themes. It's sort of divine providence, being elected no matter what, even though he was shipwrecked. He found a Bible and he became a great Christian on the island, and he did get off the island too. So we'll go to John Wesley's parents. His father was Samuel Wesley, and he made the decision, interestingly, to leave his dissenting background. So instead of following his father's paths and dissenting, he chose the Church of England, and that'll be important. And at the same time, his wife, Susanna, John Wesley's mother, also left her father's dissenting background. And they were married in 1688. Samuel was the rector of Epworth. So Epworth is in Lincolnshire, which is halfway up England, kind of to the east. I should have had a map on here, but somewhere away from the city of London. So this was a terrible mismatch for him to be the rector here, even though he was there for 40 years. His rural folks hated him, essentially. I don't think that's too strong of a word. These rural people didn't like anybody who was very loyal to the crown or academic or rigorous, enforcing all the rules of the church and so forth. A story that happened here was that the king hired a Dutch person to drain this marshy area that was common to the people there, the rural people. They could use it as they pleased, but the king wanted to improve the land, and as soon as they drained it and it was maybe much more useful, it got split between the king, the Dutch person, and the gentry, so the kind of upper class there. And the poorer people were kicked out, so they didn't like him for this. They didn't pay their tithes, which went directly into his pocket. The church collected the tithes and split it between keeping up the church, paying people that had to get paid, and other taxes. They wrecked his land that was given to him as rector, so a rector got a certain part of acreage with livestock. And there are hints or rumors that they burned his house down twice. So we will get to that. His other devotions were poetry. He was known as a poet if you look him up on Wikipedia. And he spent his life doing a dissertation on the book of Job. And he wasted money on this. He was in and out of debtor's prison because he wasn't getting his tithes. His property was being ruined by his parishioners. And so it was a very difficult situation. With that, we'll talk about Susanna Wesley. I have her here as the youngest of 25 siblings in her own family, which is a strange sentence to say. I've never said something like that before. So she knows about big families and having lots of older siblings. Her and Samuel had 19 children, but only 10 survived out of infancy. And of those 10 that passed away, there were 2 sets of twins, I think, that was mentioned, and one baby was smothered by the maid accidentally while she was recovering from the birth. So there was tragedy and difficulty there, of course. But this was a very, very amazing woman. She was keeping up this house that her husband was having some difficulties. He was rector of Epworth, but that included outlying territories. He was gone away. He was in debt. He was in debtor's prison. She was maintaining this household, disciplining these 10 children that survived, which is hard to imagine. But she did a fantastic job, and she educated these children too, and even in the classics. One thing about her was she taught a Sunday school class out of her kitchen. I think she was unsatisfied with some of the visiting preachers, and so she would supplement, and it started with just her children, but eventually it grew up to 200 people. She managed the plot of land because her husband that wasn't his forte. She had famous discipline. The children had a schedule of being dressed and undressed. It was kind of strange. They only could eat at certain hours and never eating in between those hours. All the while, she maintained her own devotional time for God. So she wanted 2 hours a day to herself to devote to God, to pray, to read the Bible. And one person wrote about the scene you might see at this house, which 10 children are running around. She would take her apron over her head and make kind of a tent. She would take her Bible and make this tent, and nobody could approach her during this 2-hour period while she's doing her devotional time. So it was very, very important, the discipline she maintained. And she made sure the children, it said they were taught to fear the rod at an early age. So it was a quiet house, even with 10 kids. And this would, of course, land her in prison today. I have a quote from her, just to give you, I have a few quotes in this presentation just for their own words to come through, I hope. So this is Susanna writing to her husband Samuel. I am a woman, but I am also the mistress of a large family. And though the superior charge of the souls contained in it lies upon you, yet in your long absence I cannot look upon every soul you leave under my charge as a talent committed to me under a trust. I am not a man nor a minister, yet as a mother and a mistress, I felt I ought to do more than I had yet done. I resolved to begin with my own children, in which I observe the following method. I take such a proportion of time as I can spare every night to discourse with each child apart. On Monday, I talk with Molly. On Tuesday, Hetty. Wednesday, Nancy. Thursday, Jackie. Friday, Patty. Saturday, with Charles. So Jackie in this case is John Wesley, and of course Charles Wesley on Saturday. So she understood the importance of one-on-one time, a mother and her child, and it's just very impressive what she was able to do. So here we are finally to John Wesley. John Benjamin Wesley. I didn't even know his middle name because he never uses that middle name ever again, really. His birthday was June 17th. I have OS. That means old style. So because of this whole English Reformation, they were late to adopt the Gregorian calendar in England. So that came around 1582. Pope Gregory installed this calendar that fixed this problem with the solstice and where Easter was and the Council of Nicaea, other stuff Jim talked about last week. And the interesting thing about this is he was born on what in our calendar is June 28th, and that's my birthday. He was 15th of the 19, and he was named after two of his brothers that had predeceased him. Okay, we'll talk about one of the fires. So I think there was an earlier fire than this at the rectory. I think the cause might be undetermined, but there's very strong belief that it could have been started by some of these very outraged parishioners. On February 9th, 1709, so John was not yet 6, fire broke out, and it broke out over his sister's bed. If you can imagine this rectory, we're talking about a building that was built in the 1600s. It's thatched roof. I mean, it's going to go up like a box of matches. So everybody got out except John. And keep in mind here, Susanna was about 9 months pregnant at the time, of course. And Samuel tried to get up the steps, but they collapsed under him. So John is up in a second floor window, and there's a lot of townspeople around. So they made a human ladder, a couple of the larger, maybe one of the larger guys and a smaller guy, and they could pluck John out of this window. And right after that, the ceiling collapsed. And it's just pure luck that it didn't collapse the wrong way, because that would have killed pretty much everybody involved in that rescue operation. So this was going to live with John. This memorable event was going to live with him for the rest of his life. He would often quote this Bible verse. This is from Zechariah. And the Lord said unto Satan, the Lord rebuke thee, O Satan. Even the Lord that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? So that applied very, very strongly to John personally. Even so much so that once John found himself on his deathbed, so he thought. He was having a consumption at the time. There were lots of illnesses in the family, and of course, people in those days were lucky to live that long. But when he was 51, he thought he was about to die. So he wrote his own epitaph as part of his exercise. Here lieth the body of John Wesley, a brand plucked out of the burning, who died of a consumption in the 51st year of his age, not leaving after his debts are paid 10 pounds behind him, praying, God be merciful to me, an unprofitable servant. He was very famous. We'll find out later about his charity. So 10 pounds, I think I did the calculation to say that's a little under $3,000 was going to be the sum total of his estate when he died. Other events from John's childhood. He had smallpox along with 4 other siblings in 1712. Smallpox was not a small deal. You might have survived, but you might have been permanently scarred. John wasn't, but it was said that he handled that as a little boy very bravely. He did manage to get an education. He was nominated by the Duke of Buckingham. Sort of sounds like a character from Robin Hood, that the Duke of Buckingham knew the family, I think partly because of that fire and the fact that after the fire the kids were dispersed, and the family certainly didn't need any more debt or anything like that. So he was nominated to a boarding school called Charterhouse in 1714. He would have been 11. I quote John now about his time at this boarding school. The next 6 or 7 years were spent at school, where outward restraints being removed, I was much more negligent than before, even of outward duties, and almost continually guilty of outward sins, which I knew to be such, though they were not scandalous in the eye of the world. However, I still read the Scriptures and said my prayers morning and evening, And now what I hope to be saved by was, 1, not being so bad as other people, 2, having still a kindness for religion, and 3, reading the Bible, going to church, saying my prayers. So we know from his mother that there is discipline and method going on. That's very important to him, to have a routine, we'll say, to respect church. But clearly he's recognizing that he did not have any sort of inward living faith that was propelling him. He was just checking boxes and hoping that was going to be enough to get him by. And we're talking about kind of an adolescent here. After the boarding school, he was nominated to Oxford on scholarship. So he was a great student. He was a great student in the boarding school. He was a great student at Oxford. He was writing poetry by now. He was known for being a master of logic. Lots of debates going on at that time as part of your education at a university. He was dealing with ill health and debt, so his school was being paid for, but obviously he was not going to get much help from his folks. And he had some sort of strange illness that caused, he called it hemorrhaging, like extreme bloody noses, this kind of thing. He wasn't very healthy. He wasn't eating a lot. He still maintained this situation where he had religious habits, but not inward holiness. And inward holiness will be a key feature of what it means to be Methodist as that gets more and more developed. I think I have a quote from Oxford, or I have one here that I didn't put up there. So at this time, he was taking Holy Communion, but back then you only had to do that 3 times a year. So this was also true in the Catholic Church. Easter, a couple of times a year, you had to take communion, but most of the time it was something preserved for the priests and the people up front. So he didn't take that very seriously. He was affected by a conversation he had one night with a porter. He said he met this man that only had one coat, and that day he had only had a drink of water, no food. And he talked to him, and he said, "You thank God when you have nothing to wear, nothing to eat, and no bed to lie upon. What else do you thank him for?" And the porter answered, "I thank him that he has given me my life and being, and a heart of love to him, and I desire to serve him." So little situations like this, John would meet these people along his journey, preserved here in his journal. So a lot of that's where we get this information. It's preserved in his journal. After his undergrad, he was nominated as a fellow to Lincoln College, Oxford. Fellowship required ordination. This is now 1725. And the fact that he decided to seek ordination, first as a deacon and later that turned into a priesthood, he started to get more serious about what he was doing. I've listed some of his major influences. Thomas à Kempis, that was a 15th century, which means 1400s, German-Dutch theologian. Later, so this is how important Thomas à Kempis was to John Wesley. Later he would say that this book, Imitation of Christ, was to him next to the Bible. So that might be something I've never read. It might be something worth picking up to find out what it's all about. I can summarize it for you to say that it was about withdrawal from outward life, solitude and silence. It was about humbling yourself and attributing any good you did to God and not yourself. It was, again, denying yourself to embrace Christ, and a proper participation in the Lord's Supper. At this time, Thomas à Kempis would have been Catholic, but John Wesley takes that very seriously, the Lord's Supper. Next was something a little bit more recent. Jeremy Taylor, a book called Holy Living and Dying, and this is instructions now on how to live virtuously, how to increase your personal piety and avoid temptations. And the second half of the book is how to prepare for a blessed death. And at that time, death was certainly all around people, and it had included some model prayers to use. And something that was very contemporaneous with John Wesley was William Law's A Serious Call to Devout and Holy Living. This was written in 1729, so that's right in this time when John's making this decision. This is a challenge to Christians to please God through a life of worship, adoration, and devotion. And it's also a diagnosis of why Christians fail and ways to help with that. So these are some of his early influences. So his first position was with his father. He went back home to Lincolnshire, and one of the places that his father Samuel served was a place called Root, which is even more in the backwater. It was mentioned as sort of a bog, basically. And John was very adamant that he was going to sort of make a name for himself. He started developing some of his more famous lifelong habits, like rising at 4 a.m., which he did the rest of his life. But he was not very successful in this position. Obviously, he didn't have much experience, but I described them as rough in the presentation. There's this quote here that the rude country folk still treasured up the strange stories about William of Lindholm, the hermit known as a wizard in league with the evil one. So they were very superstitious people and not apt to take maybe, again, an Oxford-educated academic young man very seriously. That position was 1728-29, so John's about 25, 26. And he returns to Oxford now. He's called back to work in the church near the college and to tutor underclassmen. Excuse me for a minute. I normally don't talk this long. So this is where we get our famous first glimpse of what Methodism is when he goes back to Oxford. Now, Charles, who is 5 years younger, had matriculated at Oxford himself as an underclassman. So Charles was there starting in 1726. And in a very, very similar way, he perhaps didn't take his faith all that seriously, but over the course of his undergraduate degree, he became more serious. There was a story that Charles had identified a classmate who had sort of kind of fallen into maybe not such a good lifestyle. Somebody was struggling a lot, and he took him under his wing, and they kind of supported each other. They started weekly communion, and that became an important first step in this society that was forming. The term Methodist, quote unquote, actually predates John Wesley because Charles started this group right before John came back from his position at Root. Methodist is a term that was supposed to be derogatory. Other names was the Holy Club, the Bible Moths, the Enthusiasts. We heard that word earlier. Religion was not at its high point at Oxford at this time. So anybody that wanted to take communion more than necessary, wanted to study the Bible, wanted to learn Greek to read the New Testament and original, these people were going to be looked at like sort of insane people. And the fact that they formed all these different guidelines, ways to be serious, habits to take their faith more seriously, was going to be looked at sideways by the other students. John came back, and he became the leader because he had so much more experience. He was a moderator of debate. He was older, and we'll find out later that he was a very, very well-organized person, very systematic, and so it was a natural fit for him to kind of become the leader. Methodist, so okay, we mentioned that. So it started out as these four friends, John and Charles included. They started just meeting on Sunday evening, and then they met 2 days a week, and then they just met every single evening from 6 to 9. They fasted on Wednesday and Friday because they found that this was the practice of the very, very earliest Christians, so they would refrain from eating until 3 p.m. They took the Lord's Supper every week, so of course that's way over the top compared to the rest of society. And they would do a program, a system of self-examination on different topics. So I've got here that on Sunday, their topic was love of God and simplicity. On Monday, it was love of man. So they would look at themselves and answer questions about how they felt on these different topics. They also started visiting those in jail. And they also developed charitable contributions. So John received 30 pounds. When he received 30 pounds, this was about that time, he gave 2 away. That's what he could manage. He could live on 28 pounds. The next year, his salary doubled, I think this is part of his position in the church. So guess how much he gave away? He still only needed 28 pounds to live, so he gave away 32 pounds this year. And it was going to be like that for the rest of his life, that he was going to, he mentions one story where one of the orphans that they would tutor came to his house and had, terrible clothing, and he looked at his walls with all these pictures on them, and he felt terrible about this was, food or clothes for this person that he had turned into pictures for his wall. There was a little bit of controversy when one member died, because the students were saying, well, you all are insane with this fasting and whatnot, but they said he had stopped fasting a long time ago. It wasn't because of the club that caused his death. And an important event occurred when George Whitfield came to Oxford, and he wanted to be part of this club, and he was just looking for a reason to get involved. He finally found one and got connected to Charles. So George Whitfield, I won't talk about him very much, but I expect BJ would probably discuss him in the rest of John Wesley's. He was a Methodist. There were some quarrels because he was Calvinist, but he was a very, very important figure in American evangelism. So I want to talk about John's early preaching. I put this presentation past my dad before you all, and I said here that John was already traveling 1,000 miles on horseback in 1734. And my dad said, so what? It's not a big deal. Now, it's a big deal to me because I've never been on a horse. But John Wesley, and I think BJ will talk more about this itinerant preaching idea, traveled 250,000 miles on horse in his life. So that's more like, let's say it's 40 years. That's a lot more than 1,000 miles. But this is just an example of he was starting the habit. This was going to preach in the world and not just in your parish. And not just from the Book of Common Prayer, but singing hymns that weren't found in the Book of Common Prayer. So he was entering into a kind of a nonconformity that was going to cause a lot of trouble for him. But this is just the start of it. I have an excerpt from one of his sermons at that time called The Circumcision of the Heart. In general, we may observe it is the habitual disposition of the soul, which in the sacred writings is termed holiness, and which directly implies the being cleansed from sin, from all filthiness of both flesh and spirit, and by consequence, that being endued with those virtues, which were also in Christ Jesus, the being so renewed in the image of our, I'm missing that word, mind, as to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. So here is the seed of holiness living, ideas about Christian perfection, and those will become more mature in time. All right, now a big event that you may have heard about was when John and Charles became missionaries to Georgia. Georgia was started in 1732, only a couple of years before. James Oglethorpe was the chief trustee, and he's an important figure in all this because he knew Samuel Wesley, their father, and people in the university knew how serious these Methodists were. So they said, take these Wesley brothers, Charles can be your secretary, John will be a missionary to the Indians. It was about spreading gospel to the New World. And they sailed with just the 5th group to Georgia. So this is one of the very earliest folks in Georgia. And here is where I hope the hymn kind of gets tied into things. They took off in October and didn't get anywhere. It was December and they're still in England. They're in a dock. Winds are not great, but they have to stay in this boat. They kind of go to the other side of England waiting, and they don't take off till December. They don't get over to America till February. So 6 weeks was minimum. That was more like 8 weeks. And if you've never heard about conditions on one of these ships with 120 people on it, it was very brutal. It wasn't a pleasure cruise. A lot of people weren't allowed to leave the under area. So if you can imagine, they have a strong method going on in the ship of prayers, psalms. There's some Moravians on board, German immigrants that want to start something in the New World. When a storm breaks out, you don't know what's happening other than people are seasick, everybody's crowded, the boat's rocking, and this is where this quote comes in. At noon, our 3rd storm began. At 4, it was more violent than before. The winds roared round about us and whistled as distinctly as if it had been a human voice. The ship not only rocked to and fro with the utmost violence, but shook and jarred with so unequal grating motion that one could not but with great difficulty keep one's hold of anything, nor stand a moment without it. We spent 2 or 3 hours after prayers and conversing suitably to the occasion, confirming one another in a calm submission to the wise, holy, gracious will of God. And now the storm did not appear so terrible as before. Blessed be to the God of all consolation. There was now an opportunity of trying whether they were delivered from the spirit of fear as well as that of pride, anger, and revenge. In the midst of the psalm wherewith the service began, the sea broke over, split the mainsail in pieces, covered the ship, and poured in between the decks, as if the great deep had already swallowed us up. A terrible screaming began among the English. The Germans, these other folks on board, calmly sung on. I asked one of them afterwards, "Were you not afraid?" He answered, "I thank God, no." I asked, "Were not your women and children afraid?" He replied mildly, "No, our women and children are not afraid to die." Now, this event would impress anybody, I think, but it particularly impressed John because he understood people that had a real trust. It's very hard to imagine the sea is crashing down and people are trying to pump the water out. How you don't think you're sinking into the depths of the sea at this point and not completely losing your cool. So the Moravians, I just want to talk about a little bit because they're very important. We're getting close to the end. They came from this area called Bohemia, which is sort of Czech Republic near Germany. And they came from the movement of Jan Hus, which Pastor Jim mentioned last week. He was persecuted because he thought people should be allowed to take the bread and the cup, and the Bible is a good authority, and he was burned at the stake for that. This little band continued on after Jan Hus hundreds of years until they were persecuted so bad they had to go to Germany, a place called Saxony, and there was a man there called Count Zinzendorf, which is a great name. He was their protector for a while, and believe it or not, Count Zinzendorf came up with this idea called Banden, the German word. That is a small group that supports each other in religious matters, and John Wesley took this term and called it a band. So the Moravians had a huge influence on John Wesley. When they get to Savannah, instead of being a missionary, they said, "You're the pastor here. You have to take care of all of our evening and morning prayers," all the 700 people under his charge. So he was a little bit disappointed by that lack of opportunity, but he made the most of it. He established an orphan school. They did do weekly communion now. They did do morning and evening prayers. He helped them establish a garden for everybody. And he was well received at first. For example, somebody came up to him and said, "Well, we're going to impress you at our service. We can dress very nicely, believe it or not, here in this, we're on the edge of the earth, basically. We've got nice jewelry and stuff." And he said, "Actually, I prefer just plain clothes personally and maybe in the service." So everybody came dressed in their plain clothes. He had kind of an influence on the people there. The controversy. Oh, I took these pictures. So I was in Savannah last month, just visit my brother nearby. The one on the left is on a little island. This happened February 6th. At 8 in the morning, I first set my foot on American ground. Mr. Oglethorpe led us through the Moorish land on the shore to a rising ground. We chose an open place surrounded with myrtles, bays, and cedars, which sheltered us both from the sun and wind and called our little flock together to prayers. So this is what people think was that spot there on the island, and the Methodists put a monument there. And I stopped to take a picture and then was immediately eaten by tons of bugs. It's hard to imagine what life was like, but after 2 months on a ship, I think they were pretty happy. And on the right is John Wesley's statue in downtown Savannah, where he preached. There's several monuments where he preached. None of these buildings from the 1730s exist. So the controversy in Georgia, this might be one of our last topics. Mr. Oglethorpe thought that John would be more useful if he was married. He thought he's a little too enthusiastic about religion. He's a very powerful organizer and manager, and if he was married, he might be a little bit more amenable to helping me organize this area. So he introduced John to Miss Sophia Hopke, or Sophie Hopke, as she was known. And there was definitely a mutual attraction. She was considered very beautiful and elegant, and I think that was probably unusual for this small colony. And they started a courtship. They basically dated, whatever that term was for the 1730s in Savannah. For example, she looked after him when he was sick, and she sought advice on, well, what, from his friends, what does John like about this and that? And Wesley, though, he had some ideas about whether he was going to be celibate or not, whether he would ever marry. He took some of his concerns to the Moravians. The Moravians became kind of his church away from his church, so he could go there to learn from them. He talked to their elders, and they said, it looks like you're just too undecided. It's probably time to cut this off and go your separate ways, which Wesley, he took that hard, but he was going to honor their decision. He sought their advice. And she made life easier for him because she married within a month. She found a different guy and got married. Now, this was going to cause some conflict, of course. She was one of his parishioners. He wanted to correct some of her non-Christian behaviors, let's say, like any of his parishioners. Her husband was not a big fan of John, of course. There was, well, you should maybe think about how you're behaving here, and she kind of rebuffed him in public. This is a controversy. Her niece tried to smooth things over, but basically, it culminated when Wesley refused her the Lord's Supper. This was kind of a public insult, saying, you don't deserve the Lord's Supper. Now, we'll see that there was a big court battle going on after this, but he was rigorous in the rules, and he said, if you're going to take communion, you need to sign up for communion beforehand. And that was part of the rules of the Church of England to say, not exactly a confession situation, but are you following the rules? And so when he did this, it exploded, this controversy, because her uncle was the chief magistrate, the judge there in the town. So there was all these charges. Denying her the communion, nobody's going to say that wasn't what he did. Writing to her without her husband's permission, well, he was asked to do that. A lot of these strange things, and then what he was doing at church, which the court had no jurisdiction over at all. So what happened was people said he's guilty, people said he's not guilty, or he's not guilty because what he did was legitimate. They said you have to show up to court, show up to court, show up to court, and no trial ever happened or was going to happen. So he said, look, I'm being persecuted, nothing's going to get done, I need to leave. And he told people that, and they said, well, if you leave, anybody that helps you, they're going to be fined £1,000 or something like that. So he posted a notice there in that square, not far from his statue. And it said, hey, anybody that has any books that you borrowed, please return those tomorrow. And he left Savannah. So he went by boat overland, and it was interesting because he went through this town called Port Royal right next to my brother's house down there in South Carolina, made his way to Charleston, and eventually back to England. What time do we need to shut down?
We've got about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So not only did he not convert any Indians, he had this terrible failure. He left in disgrace. But I think there were some successes there. He was successful as a minister in Savannah, Georgia, while those implementations, a form of Methodism, a small form, early form, and he was very active. And he published the first, I said American hymnal, it's the first Anglican hymnal in America. He's using a lot of these German, translated German texts, and he published that in Charleston. And when he gets back to England, he's quite dejected. And this time, right after he got back, he meets Peter Böhler, another Moravian, a young man. Böhler really influenced these brothers. He was helping Charles, who was also sick. Charles had to go back early, by the way, because he was not very successful in Georgia. We'll talk more about that in the Charles section. But Böhler talked about evangelism, righteousness by faith, real conversion, not just claiming to be Christian, nominalism, we'll say. Holiness and happiness as fruits of a living faith. And this influence found its first fruit when on Pentecost, 1738, Charles had a conversion. So Charles went from being a priest, being a Christian, so he said, to truly trusting Jesus Christ as his Savior. That's the important thing, is that it is a personal living faith that drives you. And this sounds very, I think, to me, to a lot of people these days, to be very cynical, but 3 days later, John was wandering around And he was wandering around London. He heard from St. Paul's Cathedral, "Out of the depths I cry." That's Psalm 130. He went very unwillingly to a meeting of the Moravians where he heard Luther's preface to the book of Romans. So this is his quote. "At about 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." So John experienced this conversion. He was always skeptical of conversions, like a deathbed conversion where he's preaching to somebody and they say, "Oh, now I believe." He didn't believe in that until it happened to him. And when I say I'm skeptical that these two brothers maybe had these conversion events next to each other, the proof is they spent the next 40 years. I mean, John preached, they say, 40,000 sermons, 250,000 miles on horseback, changed the entire country, changed the whole world. I mean, it was not a minor thing what happened to these brothers. And this is a preview of next hymn. So Charles wrote this when he converted. That's in between those 3 days in between the two brothers. How shall I, the goodness tell, Father, which thou to me hast showed, that I, a child of wrath and hell, I should be called a child of God, should know, should feel my sins forgiven, blessed with this antipost of heaven. That word I should mention, antipost, is like a foretaste of what it's like in heaven. So this is what it means to be, to have the assurance of your salvation. And that is the end of this presentation. There time for questions, or is it just, you can always ask me, or afterwards, come see me.
What is the Moravian Church?
Moravian Church was this church that came from the Czech Republic area, Germany, that were also known as the Brethren, and they established churches in America. They influenced John, but there was they were Protestant. Yes. There was a falling out there with the Moravians over what it meant Christian perfection, but I think maybe we'll talk about that with BJ.
When the United Methodists come together, was that with the Brethren?
I don't know if that was the same Brethren.
Okay.
We'll find out, though. Any other questions about John's early life? Okay, good. Thanks.
Thank you very much.